We are live.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's panel on Crisis and Renewal Democracy in the 21st Century. I am Zsuzsanna Szelényi. I am Program Director at the CEU Democracy Institute, and it's a privilege to me to moderate this important conversation featuring distinguished experts from around the world. In recent years, we have witnessed growing concerns about de-democratization, autocratization globally. At the same time, there's a renewed focus on democratic resilience, the capacity of societies to resist, recover from, or even reverse democratic decline. This shift reflects decades of evolving research, from early studies on democratic transition in the 1990s to analysis of consolidation, and now to the challenges of democratic erosion and hopeful signs of redemocratization. At the CEU Democracy Institute, where much of this research is centered, the goal is not just to understand democracy in its current form, but to foster transformation and improvement in democratic quality, adapting to today's complex realities. Today, we celebrate the 5th anniversary of the establishment of the CEU Democracy Institute, and this event is organized by the journal of our institute, the Review of Democracy, RevDem. So let me introduce you, Mr. László Brust, Professor Emeritus at Central European University and founding director of the CEU Democracy Institute, and give him the opportunity to few opening remarks at this anniversary event. László.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Zsuzsa. Let me welcome the panelists. Thank you for accepting to serve in this panel. Let me briefly just say a few words about the Democracy Institute that deals with the question that is in the subtitle of this panel, that is Rethinking Democracy in the 21st Century. This is what we said we are going to do, and that's what we have been doing with the help of representatives of several disciplines. So among the founding fathers and mothers of this institute, we had historians, sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists, students of gender studies, network sciences, law, and so on. So anthropologists, that's a very diverse set of people. And as Zsuzsa said, we focus on not just on de- and redemocratization per se, but on the question of what kind of transformations are needed to make democracies more resilient. So from different perspectives, but this is what we do from the perspective of law and economics, political science, sociology, and so on. When we study inequalities, when we study the rule of law, we are always asking the questions not just about what factors made democratization or the emergence of illiberal regimes, but also what could make these regimes more resilient. So this is what we do. And we do that not just in Europe, but in the framework of cross-regional research project. We were honored to serve as prime movers of the Global Forum on Democracy and Development, that is in its third year now, and that had research programs, and it hosted fellowship programs in 4 continents. And resulting in lots of very important publications, but also applications for further teaching and research programs all around the globe. We are very proud of several of the undertakings that are linked to research, but serve also this goal of us serving as a platform for the renewal of democracy. Zsuzsa herself is the director of the Leadership Academy of the EU and of DI, and we also are very proud of the Review of Democracy that serves up as a global platform for interdisciplinary dialogue on issues of democracy. I would like to stop here and get back the floor to Zsuzsa, thanking again for you to come to this celebration or to this event, and I wish you fruitful discussion.
Thank you very much, Laszlo. It was a nice introduction to the Institute, and now I would like to open the floor for our panel discussion. It's a very ambitious idea to bring together such distinguished speakers from various parts of the world. And obviously, just a short introduction to our speakers, to our listeners about where we believe democracy stands in these days. So I'd like to introduce our panelists this evening. First, Pedro Abramove, who is Vice President of Programs at Open Society Foundations, former Brazilian Secretary of Justice, and a longtime advocate for human rights and democratic governance in Latin America. Other speaker is Carsten Q. Schneider. He was interim President and Rector of Central European University, a political scientist with deep expertise in European politics and democratic governance. And Fiona Tragana, who is South African Research Chair in Industrial Development and Professor of Economics at the University of Johannesburg, whose work bridges economic development and democratic progress. Before I open the floor, the Central European University has gained an increasingly global profile in recent years, a reflection of the interconnected nature of today's global challenges. Yet, the CEU's dual presence in Vienna and a little bit still in Budapest also gives it a unique European vantage point. The university has not only studied but also experienced firsthand the rise of Europe's first self-declared illiberal state in Hungary. So over the past 15 years, a distinct illiberal playbook was developed and electoral autocracies emerged all around the world. In light of the current democratic challenges, it's still Europe that remains one of the world's key arenas where liberal democratic norms dominate governance. So I'll invite Carsten Q. Schneider. From your perspective, what are the most pressing challenges European democracies face today?
Yeah, thank you, Rura, and thank you, Laci, and everybody at the Democracy Institute for organizing this event, and happy birthday. This is, of course, a very timely topic, and there are many such events. It's very difficult to say something new, but we try today. But before we get into the doom and gloom, which is unavoidable, I'm afraid, I wanted to start with the observation that democracy is almost always considered to be in crisis. So when you go and look, it's constantly, this is a feature of democracy. It is never fulfilled in its entirety. Today's crisis is therefore not really new per se, but it comes with huge force and mostly from within. And we need to see what is new and what can be learned from the past. And tonight, I think we will learn a bit about this. But democracy is also the only system that is designed to change so that it can remain the same. And it needs to change. And Laci Proust just said it in his introductory word that this is also the mission of the DI to develop ideas on how democracy can redesign itself, because one thing is for sure, the good old days are over. And maybe they weren't even as good as we now think, just because things are much worse today. So with this preliminary remark, some thoughts on what are challenges of European democracy. Some of them are actually European, the others seem to be general problems. And I distinguish between extra political or outside of the political system and inside the political system. So outside the political system, we have the international liberal order is breaking down, which is bad for European democracies. I just wonder whether it's so bad for non-European democracies. That would be an interesting twist, actually, irony of history. There's lack of economic growth, the losing out on key future technologies, electric vehicles, photovoltaic, data and AI, the democratic decay or catastrophe. Yes, 3 days ago, I saw that if nothing is done with immigration, Italy in 2020, I mean, in 60 years, is a population half what it is now. And this is the trend for almost all European countries. Climate catastrophe, which in an ironic twist of justice, global justice, hits Europe more than they wished. Now, given that they caused most of the problem, it's sort of justice done. Then there's also regional integration. How can the EU be a democracy? How can democracy be operating beyond the nation state? And at the same time, how can we have subnational democracy work, or even national democracy work, if you're in an international organization, in an integrated organization like the EU? So these are problems that European democracies face. With it together, and not totally unrelated, but sort of inner democratic trends, is parties are going bust. They used to be the carrier of liberal democracy. They trained elites for office, they aggregated interest, they formulated policy alternatives, they structured public discourse and filled public offices. Almost all of these functions are not fulfilled anymore. And the consequence or symptoms, I don't know, is that outsiders get into high offices, former real estate tycoons, wrestlers, you name it, KGB agents. And they come often with radical policy proposals, which in and of itself is not a problem, but oftentimes these are very damaging. The parties going bust is also hollowing out of representation, abstention, apathy. Another inner political system trend that we see not only in Europe is the destruction of the public sphere. This is also a key cornerstone of liberal democracy. Media privatized, they pursue goals very different from informing the public or creating discourse. They want to make money. And when we talk about, hopefully later in the second round, of how to fix things, maybe we need to expropriate and destroy large media companies. I think one needs to think radically. Maybe one of the last points I want to make in this round is the destruction of the public sphere leads to the impression of polarization. So data, as far as I can see, does not show us so polarized in basic principle and basic values. But it doesn't even matter so much as long as we believe that we are polarized, and then clever agents abuse this belief, and we have a problem. Last but not least, it's a European thing, and it's related to several of the points I have mentioned before, is this ever smaller policy space. So you vote for a government and you think they can change, and then they say, well, I can't because there is the Constitutional Court, there is EU law, there is the market, there is you name it. While I recognize that this is the good old tension between liberalism that constrains power and democracy, some of the grievance and some of the protest against, I think, liberal democracy as it was in the past years was about this impression given, I think wrongly even, by liberal politicians that they can't do anything anyway. And that is a narrative that is very damaging. And maybe I leave it at this introductory statement.
Thank you very much. You definitely raised a couple of very interesting and important points, and moving on beyond gloom and doom, which is probably a smart attitude in a situation when we are in a complex challenges. So I'd like to move on a little bit. The processes of de-democratization and re-democratization are inherently contextual. We live in our own countries and political communities, yet there are global patterns and lessons which are beginning to emerge. In Brazil, the liberal turn introduced under Jair Bolsonaro was halted in 2022 through an extraordinary mobilization of civic and political forces. This enabled President Lula's victory and initiated a process of democratic renewal, albeit amid significant challenges. So I'd like to invite Pedro Abramove. What lessons should pro-democracy forces worldwide learn from the Brazilian experience, which is an ongoing challenge, if I understand well?
Definitely. Thank you very much. And it's such a pleasure to be here debating at CU, at the Democracy Institute, at this important anniversary. I think so I will focus, and of course happy to discuss more broadly, but let's start, of course, with Brazil, right? And I think when we think of Bolsonaro, of course he fits some of the issues that Carsten was mentioning, right? And a lot of the politics of Jair Bolsonaro could be the politics of Orbán, the politics of many others, new illiberal politicians that we've seen emerging in the world more recently. And that's part of the story, right? And let's focus on that. But there is also another part of the story, which is Jair Bolsonaro is also a 20th century, not only a 21st century, but it's also a 20th century character, right? He's someone that comes from the army, from a country that was a dictatorship during 25 years between 64 and 85. And his role in Brazilian politics for a long time was to be kind of the single voice defending the dictatorship, right? For when the country was kind of already democratized and has got back to democracy, he would only, right, when he voted as a congressman, when he voted for President Dilma Rousseff impeachment in 2016, he voted honoring the head of torture in Brazil, knowing that she was someone that was herself tortured during the dictatorship. So he was clearly one that never was part or never believed in democracy and made it clear in his kind of political perspective, right? Someone that clearly honored the dictatorships of the past. He was almost, I would say, accidentally put in the position of being a 21st authoritarian leader, right? Even if he was clearly with the mindset of the 20th century. So I think the first lesson from Brazil is that Brazil was able, right, to fight back. But then, of course, when he got in power, right, he got in power through disinformation networks. He got in power through non-traditional parties. He got in power with alliance, right, with a kind of a global extreme right that was, and the narratives and the issues and the values, right, that clearly could mobilize a country after corruption scandals, security crisis, right, and others. So he was someone that clearly was put in this place and performed as an illiberal 21st century authoritarianist. And I think the lessons from Brazil in that case was that, yes, the judiciary, most of all, right, but also the press and civil society were able to resist that, right? And I think not by a lot, right? He wasn't reelected by 1% of the votes, right? But the truth is that, again, particularly the judiciary was really strong in blocking his attempts to gain more power. The press, I think, also resisted, especially after COVID. I think in the beginning there was still a honeymoon period, but especially after COVID was very important. And civil society was able to mobilize to kind of work with Congress, work with the judiciary, provide enough information to push back in a way that in many crises and kind of peak moments of crisis that we had during Bolsonaro's term, the Brazilian democracy was able to resist. But after the election, when he doesn't, and also that's part of the 21st century playbook yet, he doesn't recognize the results immediately. The judiciary, the press, Congress clearly came in and said, no, the results of the election are valid, right? There should be a transition of power, even if Bolsonaro doesn't recognize that. What we learn later is that the 20th century authoritarian was always present there. And he tried to perform a coup in the kind of traditional 20th century form, right? With the army, asking the army to, right, with plans to assassinate the elected president and the chief justice. We learned that, I mean, we knew this was a possibility, and civil society was clearly working to prevent that. And, having a peak of kind of the riots that almost imitated the US, the Capitol invasion, invading also the palace of the president, Congress, and the judiciary. But this was clearly connected with a traditional coup d'etat attempt from Bolsonaro. What I think is interesting is that the Brazilian democracy was clearly ready to fight back because the Brazilian constitution from the late 80s was built in response to the dictatorship. The Brazilian democracy was ready to fight a coup d'etat. The Brazilian democracy was ready to kind of in a reasonable period of time have a due process, and to have Bolsonaro and his accomplices convicted, right? He'll be probably sent to jail very soon in this process, because this was something that never happened. Brazil had tens of coup attempts in its past, failed coup attempts. No one has ever been punished. So Brazilian democracy now is ready to punish this kind of attempt, and that's something new, right? I think the question is Brazilian democracy ready to fight back what the threat that is still there, which is the liberal threat, the 21st century threats that we saw, that we kind of, again, Brazilian democracy survived by very narrow margin in the elections. And I think for that, I'll just end with kind of a provocation for the debate, which is, we talk a lot, right, in political science about democratic resilience, and I think that perspective for me has a flaw in the use of the word resilience that political science took from the physics, because in physics, right, the concept of resilience is a material that is resilient, a material that has the ability to get its original shape once submitted to stress. And I think the question exactly with democracy is that are we going exactly in as Carlos is saying, in a kind of design that can change so it can remain the same, or do we need to, after the stress, produce something new, right? So is it about resilience, or is it about resistance, right? Is it about something that can perform? And I think the lessons that we are receiving now from Brazil is that in order not to just protect what he had as democracy and kind of the 21st century style coup, but in order to protect from the illiberal, I think the most important thing is what can we produce and how can we show, and I think the US is a big lesson on this, that we are not just defending the past, but we are kind of producing something for the future that is connected with people's imagination, with the ability of democracy to produce something new, and more important, to address the concrete socioeconomic challenges that people have. But I think let's continue that discussion at the debate.
I think that, thank you very much. It was really very nice that you brought up the 20th and 21st century way of thinking, because we are now way into the 21st century, and oftentimes we still think, and I think it's a good point to come back to that, what we, let's say, whoever we are, how we think. But you finished with something, another important point, which gives us the wonderful opportunity to pass the talk on Fiona. You started to talk about inequality and equal chances and economic development. And the African continent has demonstrated an extraordinary potential over the past decades. Actually, this is, many people say, an African century, which is driven by demographic dynamism, improvements in education and healthcare, rapid technological advancement. And a few countries have established high-quality democratic systems, with South Africa standing as a prominent example. To me, democracy there has underpinned progress in economic growth, social services, housing, infrastructure, as even challenges such as unemployment, inequality persist. But the link between democratic governance and social and economic modelizations seems to clear, at least from that distance where I am sitting at the moment. When I'm talking to people from South Africa, many of my friends, the democracy discourse somehow does not necessarily resonate to them. So they are much more in development logic. So maybe this is a good point of for your intervention, Fiona, as you are an economist, but obviously have important comments on this relationship to democracy. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Greetings from Johannesburg. Really glad and honored to be here and on this important occasion, and on this very pertinent topic of democracy. I myself come from a country which is a young democracy, 31 years, and still grappling with many of the challenges of democratic deepening, development, and as you mentioned, the ongoing challenges of inequality, poverty, unemployment, and so on. I think democracy means many different things to many people. So with some notable exceptions, most governments or most countries describe themselves as democratic. There's not many countries that kind of don't make any pretense at democracy. So just to take one example, our neighboring country here of Swaziland, also known as Eswatini, an absolute monarchy in which the king controls everything, politically, resources, and so on. But they came up with a term of monarchical democracy to try and play on this discourse of being in some way a democratic state. So yeah, with a few exceptions, most countries now try and at least use the discourse of democracy, but with very different meanings. And I think this also, for me, draws attention to the importance of in exploring what democracy really means, going beyond the formal institutions and processes of democracy, to build democracies that have depth, are meaningful and inclusive, and that in some ways deliver changes in people's lives. And I think these are all ingredients of what we could call resilient democracies. Where democracies are shallow and are non-inclusive, politically, socially, economically, this also opens the way for either anti-democratic forces or conservative forces to make inroads and gain popular support. And this can be through different channels, can be through voter apathy, just not turning, non-participation in the voting process, can also be through these conservative anti-democratic forces actually winning popular support themselves, and in other scenarios through popular acquiescence to coups, either soft or hard, included in democracies. The reality is that even where conservative, pro-elite, or even anti-democratic forces have been elected, as does happen, numerically, this doesn't just happen through support of elites, right? It happens through some sort of electoral support from working class and middle class. Otherwise, they couldn't get voted in. So yeah, I think this draws attention to the importance of democracies which are deep-rooted, inclusive, and which people feel included in politically, socially, and economically. So this also links, and I think as you've said in your opening, in your introductory remarks, politics and economics, which I think is are impossible to separate in any case. It's important to build. Let me put it like this: to avoid having a combination of nominally democratic institutions and processes with non-inclusive economic policies and economic structures, in which it's elites that primarily benefit from the fruits of growth, and that these democratic institutions and processes coexist with high levels of inequality, as you see, for example, in South Africa, as well as in Brazil, and much, in fact, of Southern Africa and Latin America, privilege alongside poverty and unemployment. This provides a fertile ground for people to be mobilized by exclusionary and populist political projects, and for the flourishing of racism, of xenophobia, of mobilization on the basis of conservative social values, conservative religious politics, such as conservative evangelism, for fascism and neo-fascism. I think, so what I'm trying to argue is that where you've got this kind of combination of a shallow democracy politically with non-inclusive economic policies, that kind of leads to this fertile ground. And there are many historical and current examples of this. In South Africa, although there are obviously it is a vibrant democracy in many ways, but amongst people there is also growing disillusionment. Sometimes people would say we can't eat a vote, and it sounds simplistic, but for somebody who doesn't have a job, has never worked, has very little prospects of having a job, one can understand that kind of frustration. And how that has, in some cases, led to, it's a mobilization along ethno-nationalist lines, xenophobia and Afrophobia against people from the rest of the continent, and so on. And we can think of many other examples internationally. Working class Trump voters who might be working 3 minimum wage jobs just to put food on the table, but make voting decisions based on gun rights or abortion rights or whatever, and are mega supporters. We can think about Argentina, the kind of desperation for alternatives. From the outside, we might say, how can people vote for this right-wing lunatic? But people do, right? Even the votes for Bolsonaro, it wasn't just from a privileged elite, right? But people were, he managed to make inroads into the working class, for example, through right-wing religious evangelism and so on. We can think about in India, mobilization along religious lines. And I mean, we could go back in history to Nazis and so on. So we can't preach the benefits of democracy if people don't feel included in economic opportunities. And this also links to the role of the state. With the neoliberalism over the past couple of decades, in many countries, we have the rolling back of the state in healthcare, in education, in economic policy, and so on, through privatization, and like the shrinking role of the state, for example, in the provision of various public services. And it can become a vicious circle where the shrinking role of the state economically feeds into a lack of confidence in the state, and growth of the private sector in domains which traditionally the state was stronger in. And this kind of becomes a vicious cycle. People lack confidence in the state. It leads to a kind of impetus for further privatization and so on. So just to take one example from our own country, the security industry. There's now in South Africa more people employed in the private security industry as private security guards and so on than in the army and the police combined, which is obviously it's a threat to democracy. And it becomes that kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, right, where people feel that lack of confidence and then hire private security services and so on. But it is a significant threat to democracy. I think I might be out of time. I would also like to talk about maybe some aspects of economic policy that I think can be inclusive and pro-democracy, but maybe we can come back to that in the questions. Let me just close my opening comments with just emphasizing that I think democracy is something precious, something to be nurtured, not something to be taken for granted. And it has to be a living democracy, not just something that we celebrate. Okay, we reached democracy 31 years ago, or however many years in different countries. It has to be something which is built on an ongoing basis in the fabric of society. So in civil society and trade unions, in mass-based political parties and so on, democracy is never something that can be imposed from outside, for example, through regime change. It has to be a living democracy built and strengthened on an ongoing basis by people in the country. Let me leave it there.
Well, thank you. Thank you. This was really wonderful. And I would open the discussion with going where you finished, and which is also something both of Pedro and Karsten mentioned in some way earlier. So, how do we define democracy? I don't want you to try to do it now, because obviously this is a huge issue, but still, is there any 21st century concept on democracy, which is different from the liberal ideals we believed during the 20th century, saying that, if there is a certain level of well-being of people and proper processes and many people participating in decision-making, that's a kind of flourishing democracy. And that brings to, people from one step to another. It doesn't seem to work any longer. And your comments also demonstrate that this type of understanding and working of democracy become tired somewhat, at least definitely in Europe, that you can see, maybe not in South Africa. I don't think we have, big mass-based political parties any longer. Anyway, I would open this discussion for also Karsten and Pedro, and you can come back, Fiona. What are the kind of 21st century features? Basically, what is a new narrative we are looking for, which can bring a bigger number of people together, to rally behind? I don't know who would like to. Yeah, Karsten, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Ruja, also for formulating the question. I had this written down almost before you asked the question, and thanks to Fiona and Pedro, who mentioned a couple of things where I think I can follow up and clarify, at least for myself. The point on that democracy is not in crisis is really true, because the eastern part of Germany was also the Democratic Republic of Germany, and it was so. It's really the fight about liberal democracy. We must understand this. Those who are the enemies now of liberal democracy are not anti-democratic in their own minds, but they're anti-liberals. And while there is not so huge differences between Xi Jinping, Putin, Erdogan, Trump, these which now come to be called revolutionary conservatives, a term that I like, they do agree on certain things, like the political system must be hierarchical. It's the survival of the strongest in a game that they define. They bend the rules to their favor, and it's power concentration in the hands of the governments with little to no checks and balances. So this is illiberalism. And you could still say, well, but people voted for me, so I can do whatever I want. And I agree with Fiona, this is not just frustrated, angry, misguided deplorables who voted for them, but people who sympathize with this or who want things to get fixed. But once we understand the critique that is formulated by the enemies of liberal democracy, I think we can formulate better counter responses. And I agree with Pedro, and I want to just reiterate that's what I also meant. We cannot go back to the same systems. We must change, but what must remain the same, and here I'm a little bit in disagreement with you, Zsuzsa, is that it should be still liberal democracy in the 21st century, but with procedures and processes and institutions that look totally different. But the essence must remain. It's rights-based, participatory, open-ended. We don't know who wins elections, right? And it must be a repeated game. And very importantly, it must deliver on citizens' expectations. And the expectations of citizens in democracies are twofold. One is, well, if we are a democracy, we need to play fair. There is no corruption, there is no voter cheating, and so on and so forth. That's so-called democratic performance. But what Fiona, you mostly talked about is something that also autocrats must respond to. Its so-called systemic performance, security, growth, well-being. And on all these things, of course, democracies must deliver. Studies don't show that necessarily liberal democracies are much better in doing this, but it also, in the inverse, means autocracies are not much better in this. So all the promise of more growth or more security is mostly not true. So once we have that clear, I can't now answer the question of how democracy should look like. What replaces parties? What institutions could play the role of parties? Or we used to have newspapers, everybody would watch them, or public TV, everybody would get the same news. We don't have, what can replace that? So we need to think in functional equivalence of things that gave us a quite good time, at least in Europe or in the West for quite some time, how this looks like in the 21st century. I don't have an answer to that, unfortunately, but I think that we need to preserve. Maybe the last point, rights-based, participatory, and open-ended. At a very interesting event also at the DI in Budapest some weeks ago, Ivan Krastev pointed out something that now is so obvious for me, but I hadn't seen it before. One of the problems for liberal democracies nowadays is that every problem seems to be an endgame problem. So if we lose the next elections, it's over. If we don't fix climate change now, we must turn into terrorists. So, and I'm not judging whether one or the other is true, the statement, but the feeling that it's not a repeated game is the end of liberal democracy, because it's a game that you play in eternity and you can always win once you have lost. And if this is not the belief anymore, then things break down.
Pedro, please. Yeah, it's definitely your turn.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No,
That's
thank you, and thank you, Fiona, also, and Carsten for those remarks. I think there are, and I definitely agree, and I think with kind of maintaining the core of what liberal democracy is, that has nothing. I mean, people add some Christmas trees to the definition, but I think those things we need to be mindful of, but I definitely agree that that's at the core. But I think also there are some challenges that are coming not exactly from the liberal aspects of the new authoritarians, right? But there is challenges that come, for example, from China, right? The fact that we are seeing a state like the Chinese state being able to deliver to people, to its people in a way, right, and produce, like from being able to produce, build a hospital in 6 months or a bridge in 4 months, right? And those are things that it's very easy for people to say, well, authoritarian regimes are being able to do that, democracy can't, so democracies need to deliver. And first of all, I think there is a sense that the easy, of course, question is, democracy is to just think that democracies are not able to deliver, right? That only authoritarians are able, that the problem is because that China can deliver because it's not a democracy. And that's simply not true, right? First of all, we had strong liberal democracies after the Second World War in the US and in Europe that were able to deliver to its citizens and being able to kind of build bridges in 6 months, build health, public health systems, right? In some years, and deliver much more. So the issue is not democracy itself, and we need to. It is much more neoliberalism, right? It is the way we look into the state, and that the fact that we kind of couple that into democracy, and that almost an idea that we can only call democracy those who play by the rules, not of liberal democracy, but of neoliberalism, right? So that's, I think, important to untie and say, well, it is possible, right, for democracies to deliver. But in order to do that, we can't enter, and I think, of course, I won't enter in the abundance discussion here, but it's one that I think it's a nice one for another day. But I think it is important for us to think that it's less about thinking how democracy can deliver, but much more, what are people fighting for, right? What are the struggles? What are the things that really matter for people, right? When they go to the streets, when they and remember that those struggles, right, the politics, right, what are people being political about? Politics create social ties, right? The democracy is not just a representation of the existent social ties. If democracy is healthy, it's constantly changing in a way that it can create social ties. Trump created social ties. Bolsonaro created those people. They were not Trumpists. They were not Bolsonaristas 2 years before they arrived at a phenomenon. They were able to use politics to create bonds, create beliefs, create ideas that are transforming politics from the other side. I think that the question for us is looking at people that are going in Africa, in Nepal, in Indonesia, right, in Peru, to the streets to fight for socioeconomic rights right now, and trying to think how democracy can respond to that, right? How democracy can incorporate those fights, and how democracy can rebuild based on the things like what Mandani is doing in New York, right? Affordability, rent, like bringing those issues and elevate those issues as central issues for politics, for me, is the only way that we can believe again in the possibility of democracy reinventing itself, preserving its core, but fighting back authoritarianism that are clearly being able to kind of produce passion, produce social ties, and in some cases also delivery, right? So I think that for me is the core of the response that we need to focus on. There is no clear response, but where we need to look at if we want to rebuild democracies.
Well, it's a fascinating issue that you brought up so many important points. And can I just challenge a little bit the discussion further? Because you said what matters for people, that their social ties, communities are very important. I mean, one thing that is really very tangible in these days, and also showed by the research, and also we all see it by media, is that security and stability is important for people. It's a basic human need. This comes from work, but it comes from physical security of whatever people believe is security means for them. And this is definitely shaken. And in this context, the open-endedness of liberal democracy somehow seems to be too complicated, because it somehow contradicts with the notion of, security. So what would you say about this? Because I think that here we have a problem, and autocrats do not have a problem who easily promise anything they want, and because they are hierarchical and not very open-ended, they can promise at least security, whether they are able to deliver it or not. I don't know who would make a comment on this contradiction, because that goes back to the narrative question, that what we, Carsten.
I think there are many angles to it, but why don't we start with Kant and that two democracies don't go to war, which means most wars, almost all, are fought with some non-democracy involved. So that's the best example of where there is no security delivered. So it's all maybe temporary. You can say, well, all migrants out, or what is it? But sooner or later, there is violence involved. You have repression. I mean, the most effective secret services are usually developed in dictatorships because they lack other means of knowing what people want. So they have to have the Stasi and KGB to read people's mind, because they also need to follow the public will. It's not that they can do what they want. Also, they need to respond. But I mean, it's a good question. And one thing that came first to my mind before Kant was that you, of course, have to educate people. People need to want to engage, what Pedro said, to have some passion for democracy. It must be worthwhile. And if losing an election doesn't mean losing your life, then okay, people are willing, and then they say, well, now it's the Social Democrats, even though I don't like higher taxes, but it's not life-threatening. So indeed, in circumstances where losing election and policy changes mean that you're thrown out of the country, or you lose your job and all your rights, then I think people will not really be in favor of democracy and rather be protected. But there is no need, there is no reason for why one would need to go into these end games. Maybe that's my first try on that difficult question.
I don't know, if anyone want to make comments on this, or on security issue. Maybe Fiona, you didn't finish your contribution before on the economic.
Yeah, no, I mean, I commented a little bit on the security issue. I don't know if I have something further to add on that, but maybe just to touch on your previous question, where you were asking sort of what is democracy and so on. I mean, for me, I'm not a political scientist. I'm a mere economist, so I'm not even going to attempt to offer any definitions. But what I would say is that liberal democracy isn't enough. In the sense that, I suppose it depends what we mean by that, but democracy has to go beyond voting. Voting is obviously the absolutely fundamental pillar of democracy. It's necessary, but not sufficient. And this goes to sort of the depth of democracy and the sense of inclusion that can't just be imparted by, for example, civil education programs, but by people's lived experience of democracy and of economic outcomes and so on. So I think some of the aspects of this are a broad-based political participation and some sort of aspects of participatory democracy that go beyond just going to the ballot once every 4 or 5 years, but being able to input, for example, through public hearings, through mass-based organizations and so on in the political process on an ongoing basis. Includes a rights-based culture, human rights and so on, that are not just sitting on a piece of paper, but where people have mechanisms, whether judicial or through local government participation and so on, for actually giving effect to those rights that are written into the constitution or into laws or whatever. Economic democracy, and obviously this in itself has various dimensions that we could talk about, ranging from like in the workplace, on the shop floor, what is, do we, what is the influence of workers and firms, to more broadly influence and inputs into economic policy decisions. I think, yeah, this links as well. I just wanted to sort of comment maybe on the decline of the trade union movement in many countries over time. And I think this has had a negative effect on democracies, on people's political orientation, and it's part of the democratic fabric of a society. And I think this is one of the ways in which we can see a difference, so for example, between North America and West Europe, where even though in Western Europe the trade union movement has declined over time in union density, political power, and so on, but those kind of social democracies, the organized workers have a different role to play than in the US, for example. It's obviously also a different electoral system, party-based versus presidential and so on. But with all the limitations of democracy in West Europe, I don't think we would have a Trump. I'm talking about Western Europe now, yeah. And obviously the differences go beyond the trade union movement and the organized working class, but I think it is one of the differences. And it's kind of then the ingredients which go into people's voting decisions and the multiple identities that people have. And yeah, maybe my last comment related to that is the importance of building a wide range of progressive forces. I'm going to put it in a broad way like that. In most cases where right-wing populist movements have come to power, it goes alongside with weaknesses of, we could call it the left, but I want to be even broader than the left. Let me call it progressive forces in general. Of course, there can be polarized societies where you've got strong on sort of the left and right, but generally where conservative and populist and authoritarian forces have been voted into power, as I said earlier, numerically, they have to have tapped into significant votes from the middle class and the working class. And often it's people are searching for alternatives. People are having struggles in their daily lives, putting food on the table, taking care of their families, struggles with their personal security, crime, unemployment, and so on. These are some of the weaknesses from progressive forces, and people are often desperate for alternatives. Not every person who votes for a right-wing authoritarian figure is necessarily themselves ideologically right-wing, but sometimes it's a desperation, it's a searching for alternatives. So it also comes back to those progressive forces to rebuild those organizations and to offer real meaningful alternatives to people.
Well, I would, from here, thank you, Fiona, bring a little bit, introduce another topic that we are somehow touching, but did not really go into details. It's about voting. So new 21st century autocrats are all, voted into power, and many of them remain in power by vote. So they are able to destruct either the electoral system, the state system, the checks and balances, in order that they can repeat electoral victory again and again. So they are pretty good in mobilizing and getting the legitimacy by votes. So it's not easy to trust political parties any longer, that they are the Democrats and they are the ones that are safeguarding democracy. But maybe we should, trust more in civil society. But of course, then we come to the problem that Fiona just mentioned, that traditional sources of civic forces are not there any longer, because we are very atomized societies. So I would like to go back and ask Petra about how to organize mass movements, because there was something quite specifically important in Brazil, and I didn't see big successful mass mobilization in other countries in recent years. So there must be something that we can learn from that, or actually what are your thoughts or experiences, and what your ideas about that?
Sure. No, thank you. So of course I agree with Fiona, right? I think it was the structure of the 21st century democracy, in particular of social democracies, was built with the idea that unions were the main way, right, or that labor could be organized, and from that, democracy could mirror in some way the representation of, capital and labor, and those contradictions that could be mediated there. I think, of course, 21st century brings a crisis of mediation in different ways, right? And for labor, for political parties, for many industries that were built from labor records to, and there are many industries, movies and many others, that mediation, that traditional mediation that exists in the 21st century doesn't exist anymore, right? It doesn't mean, and it hasn't mean, I think, especially for the authoritarians, that it's not possible to mobilize mass movements, and we've seen that, right? I think the challenge is exactly how you organize those movements in a way that they can produce something constructive, right? And I think in order to do that, first of all, of course, you still need there are spaces that you need to recognize the legitimacy of different social movements, right? And this will be very different in different countries, from the studios movement in some places, from the movements of, gig workers in others. And I think an ability that needs to come from politics of understanding the fragmentation of the nature of those movements and provide something that can, resonate with all of them. For the liberal side of that equation, it's easy to do that, right? And they are doing that based on some kind of values. I think the challenge and what we are seeing when we can see successes is when we can build an ability to talk to those movements and understand what are the concrete issues that is talking to people, right? So from again, affordability, youth unemployment, regulation of gig workers, and I think if the conversation can be organized around the issues that resonate with people, right, and trying to build on that, I think that's very important. I think just a last point on this is the main trap is when you try just to emulate your adversary, right? And you try to play it on your adversary's field. And you try to think, well, because the right wing is producing, a value in with the security speech, right, against migrants or against gender ideology or against, right, in many of those aspects, we need to do the same. And when you do that, you're already lost, right? You can never pretend to be your adversary, right? You need to be creative to understand what are the things that can mobilize, that speak to social justice, that speak to, and people are mobilizing for those issues in many parts of the world, right? It's not true that security can't come. Unemployment is insecurity, right? And if you have a solution for unemployment, you're probably closer to providing a solution than if you're closing the borders, especially in the long term, right? So I think it is, stop trying to emulate the opponent and trying to listen what are the agendas that are coming from those protest movements, and propose something that can tie them up, that still can mobilize them.
Well, I can provoke you further on this, Because, of course, these very sophisticated 21st century autocrats are not only anti-migration, anti-something. They are definitely, I mean, fear-mongering is definitely a major tool in their toolkit, but they are also pro-family, they are pro-nation, they provide a larger community, like make, Hungary, America, Brazil great again, which is also an important element of this, belonging, gathering, whether this is real or not. So I think they play anti and pro narratives, and this is definitely a challenge. It's not only one instrument.
Let me use the concrete example of what happened in Brazil in the last months, right?
Mm-hmm.
When Bolsonaro clearly made a huge mistake, right, of pressuring Trump to increase tariffs in Brazil with a clear political statement of, this is in order to free Bolsonaro, right? This is a big gift for Lula, right? You have your opponent coming to another nation and kind of damaging your country in order to create personal benefits. But what Lula did that I think was the smart part and many others did, I think, after Trump was able we're seeing progressives rallying around the flag and creating reclaiming nationalism. This, for the Brazilian left was very important because nationalism and the Brazilian flag was a symbol of the right in the last 15 years. It had been a symbol of the left when we were fighting against the dictatorship, right? But it was captured by the right wing, and now it's possible. The right wing went to the streets with the American flag, and the left wing went to the streets with the Brazilian flag. So first of all, it was possible to rebuild a nation, but it was a nationalism not built out of the exclusion, but a nation that Lula took advantage to say we are fighting those threats by passing a progressive economic agenda. We are taxing the rich, we are exempting the poor, right? And so he connected a pro-labor agenda, saying this is who we are as Brazilians, and creating a nationalism that is based on solidarity, that is based on the spirits and the values, right, of progressives, in opposition of an anti patriotism that is exclusive, that is based on fear, right, from the right. And he reversed his popularity crisis based on that. So I think there is a lesson there, which is exactly when we are able to take opportunities like this to create a sense of community that is based on solidarity, right? Nationalism is not only something that can be based out of exclusion. There is a possibility of building also those new values around.
Well, that's really great. Maybe this is a moment that we start to talk about, how the latest American developments influence or impact our societies and our democracies, because it might not necessarily be a bad thing, as Petro's example demonstrated. So we can maybe try to get it from the angle of what kind of development of rethinking our values and democratic ideas can be provoked, let's say like this, by this very arrogant US administration, which is so overwhelming and assertive globally. Karsten, would you like to comment on the...
What does it mean if the United States leaves the West and turns sort of into an autocracy, which most would say it has already happened. The question is, will it last for long? So assume this is the case. Then, as you seem to suggest, Ruja, then the good part is everybody who observes this and is sort of in his more or less right mind thinks like that is not how we want to end up. I wouldn't bet on this being a large majority. So it also depends on how you perceive, which media you watch, whether or not this is a success story in the United States or not. But the other aspect, apart from the demonstration effect, is that there is real influence then exerted on European democracies, on Latin American, on African democracies. And whether or not that influence is positive for democracies depends on things. Are you geostrategically relevant and important? Do you have rare earths or not? So all to say, without the United States, it's very difficult to assert democracies in the world scene. So that is on many levels. I mean, in a similar context, we discussed about higher education and what would it mean if the United States is not a liberal democracy and destroys Harvard. So that would be bad. There are some short-term gains maybe for Europe, but in the long term, it's very difficult. So I can't say more than that. Maybe the last point. I'm really surprised. I was surprised by the genius of illiberal people to make both Trump, but even Putin after the invasion of Ukraine an asset. When I thought, I mean, now everybody must understand that this is not a viable option. That it's clear who is the bad and who are the good guys, but the narrative is then so much turned upside down that many people seem to doubt to know who is the bad and who are the good guys.
Probably this is also kind of 21st century phenomena, right? We don't know any longer. Even some people believe we know, but there are so much noise in the news. There are so many kind of not very nice narratives hanging around. I mean, there is also, it's so easy to meddle in other countries' politics since we have the internet. It's just so much more complicated, and of course, this creates a problem for all of us. That's not good or bad. Even in a very obvious situations is visible. So I turn to Fiona now. You are an economist, so you are very much, I suppose, in the middle of U.S. influences, let's say in the region of Southern Africa, of course, but elsewhere as well. So how does it look like for you?
Yeah. I mean, we're within the US domestically, of course, just this past weekend, we've seen from afar the so-called No Kings protests, apparently 7 million people, and I think I read 2,700 rallies across the continent. So people are engaged politically. I think it's important to recognize that with the Trump administration, there are both continuities and discontinuities with what's come before. Of course, a lot of it is really new and crazy and so on. In some forms of this, I mean, both domestically and internationally, are a cruder form, a more brazen and extreme form of what's come before. It's not new for the US. I mean, there have been wars, invasions internationally, funding of anti-democratic forces in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and so on, over many decades, domestically, economic policies that benefit elites, and so on. So of course there's things which are new now, and it's not just in style, right? Even in substance, there are substantial differences. But as I said, there's continuities and discontinuities. Here, in terms of domestic politics, there's a clear attempts by the Trump administration to strengthen racist, anti-democratic domestic forces. They're getting more airtime from this than they probably had in decades. The kind of the myth of the white genocide, which was just so laughable here.
I think we lost. Maybe we just wait for a second.
A tariff, and it's also the kind of come from a.
We lost you, Fiona, for a second. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Can you just repeat your last sentence, because there was some problem with the line?
Yeah, I think I was just maybe talking about the unpredictability, both economically and politically, that you just don't know what's going to come next in terms of whether it be tariffs or political statements, and so on, and the linking of the two. And Brazil is an example of that, where tariff changes were overtly based on attempts to influence domestic politics. Also in South Africa, the tying of tariff policies with domestic policies aimed at deracializing the economy and so on. So yeah, there are certainly new aspects as well.
Well, this is definitely a big challenge for us, and we probably will speak a lot about that in the future, because we are just a half year through the Trump administration, and until now, the United States for like 70 years was a secure supporter of democracy globally, which is not the case any longer. Even more, it's actually provoking, supporting, helping new autocrats, whether they are on government or in opposition, and openly intervening in other countries' politics. You already mentioned a couple of examples, and I'm afraid we are going to see more in the future. And this definitely requires some important reaction in, revolutionary thinking. And I'd like to come back to this. Karsten mentioned this right at the beginning of your contribution, that we have to think radically. I think that's what you said. Can we a little bit think about radically? I don't know. It's really a big, a massive challenge around us. You also mentioned, Karsten, a couple of minutes ago, that we do need the United States because we are intertwined, and not just in Europe, but many other parts of the world, that the United States was until now a very significant global power. It's not any longer, or it's a different kind, let's say. So how can we find our new partners in pro-democracy, which you mentioned oftentimes, sometimes it's left organizations, but when we talk about democratic, it's not always necessarily left or progressive. I really hope that also conservative political forces can and are democratic and safeguards of democracy. So how could we somehow revitalize democratic learning and cross-country support, let's say, without the United States? Who can be our allies? Who are the actors with whom we want to collaborate? Do we want to learn from? So do you have some comments and ideas of this?
Well, I mean, first on the first part where you said that we should think radically, expropriate Facebook and what is it, and TikTok, and gain public control over these broadcasting media. Will we ever succeed? That's the question. I mean, the only force that can do this is the European Union. So somehow we need to fix the European Union to be more bold, to act more boldly on the international stage and on such policy issues. Reasserting the scope of politics, where some things that we thought were outside of the scope of liberal politicians, I think we need to reopen these questions. And I confess here something, that when Orban came to power in 2010, and I lived in Hungary, yes, but I wasn't really much involved in politics. And like colleagues and friends like Lazzi were, of course, worried. And I said, okay, what's going on? Because the first thing he did was he threw out the IMF. I mean, it was with our private pension money. But still, I said, what? You can do this as a small country like Hungary? You can do this when Merkel would say there is no alternative for Germany. And now we have a party that is called Alternative for Germany in response to the claim that we can do nothing. You've elected us, but what shall we do? It's the market. So to find the right measure of what is subject to politics, without, of course, going full out. I mean, one thing Trump is doing. He said, "Oh, no independent central bank, no rules, no constitutional court that can rule it." That is too much, but it was too little before. So I think Trump, like many of these people, do address problems that we had, but we didn't dare to tackle them, and now we gave it to them to provide solutions that make things even worse. So. It is, and the second part of your question was more about, if you remind me, not the thinking radical,
Well,
but who are the partners? Yeah, yeah. The ones that are sitting in the room for Europe, Brazil, Latin America, in Africa, there are those who probably are also uneasy with the influence of China. Which is both, it's very strong in as far as I can see, in Latin America and in South America and in Africa. And maybe some of them feel that they are better off doing trade with Europe. But of course, then Europe should stop with its post-colonial attitude towards especially Africa, and offer not so good deals, in agricultural politics and so on and so forth. So there were many mistakes were made on that front, and maybe it's therefore easier now to do better, because it was so bad before. What European global politics looked like. I think there's a lot of room for improvement, and that would be my partnerships. In Asia, there are countries with whom I think we need to collaborate, and then within countries. Last point, there's a lot to learn from local and regional, local democratic experiments. And I don't know, oftentimes it can't be scaled up, but sometimes things can be scaled up, and we should be just a bit more attentive of what is it that people invent in whatever region in Germany or in Argentina.
Thank you very much. Who would like to follow, Pedro or Fiona? Maybe you would also comment on, the role of what university researchers can do. Maybe, Carsten, you can come back to with this point. And of course, I'd like to give a final word at the very end to Laszlo. So, Fiona, who do we want to collaborate, or who we should collaborate? Should we collaborate at all?
You mean as university researchers?
Well, the pro-democratic forces, and of course, university researchers are typically people who, who would like to learn about the problems of the world and find, guide us to some kind of directions. So in this regard, we lost Fiona again. No, you're here. Good.
Okay. Yeah, I'm here, but I think I missed the question. Maybe we can take Pedro. And
Pedro, then would you take over, please?
Sure. No, I think in terms of, so first of all, in your question about the US, right? And I think the US is still kind of an arena of dispute, right? And I think, of course, the No King movement, but also the local elections that we are seeing recently, there is enough democratic life in the US that is important. I mean, the Open Society foundations have been directly attacked by the current administration, at least in speech. And I think and this is a pattern, right? We've been attacked in many places where those authoritarian leaders come to power. And I think what we've learned from, all those experiences in the place that, the civil society, because when we are attacked, it's not about us, right? It is a proxy for the attack on civil society, right? It is that the importance to resist, right, and to show that civil society, and not only kind of to hide or to try to, again, say, so let's not work that much on migration, or let's not work, but again, show the importance for the core of U.S. democracy, that U.S. democracy wouldn't exist, even the values that are being kind of predicated from the right wing, that they wouldn't exist if there wasn't for the American civil society. So I think defending free speech, defending the ability of having different voices, defending, and I think having an alliance with what was happening in the US is very important. The second part is also preparing and looking to the future, right? We can't resist only trying to protect the past, right? And I think what we are seeing right now in the US that I think is more interesting than the last time, and maybe than what happened during the Biden administration, is that we are seeing, emerging visions about the future, from efforts like the Abundance one to the Madani campaign, right? I think we are seeing in the West there is it is very little time that Trump is in power, but in very little time, we are seeing I think a different way to resist to it that is much more looking into the future and proposing something to the future. I think this is happening in different parts of the world. So in terms of cooperation, looking into what's coming to process like the G20, both in Brazil and South Africa, that there is a lot of the discussion about how can we globally tax the super rich, the discussions that are emerging about climate that are much more connected, I think, with concrete movements that are fighting for it. The global discussion around Palestine and what are kind of the movements that are kind of changing policies and all that. So I think there is right now kind of in the same way that there is, of course, backsliding democracies in different parts of the world, there is a change in the resistance that is coming in a way that is much more connected to socioeconomic issues, to advance, to building the future. And I think connecting those dots, right, is also part of what the academics and civil society and politicians should be doing right now.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, please, Fiona.
Yeah, I think just picking up on what Pedro has just been saying, it's imperative for progressive forces to be able to capture people's imagination. So it's not just about harking back to the past. The past was also problematic in different ways and in different countries and so on. So it's about an offering, and I'm talking about an offering not just electorally, but more broadly, that captures people's imagination as real alternatives to the difficulties of their lives. I guess the challenge is always presenting policies and solutions that seem viable and implementable and practical in the short to medium term. Otherwise, you get attacked for that, whilst also tapping into people's dreams and visions for a different future. And I mean, Pedro's referred to the example of New York and the Mamdani campaign, which really does seem to have captured people's imaginations. And of course, it's not a copy and paste to say, yes, do the same thing in different contexts, but it is one living example here. And it's not just I think it's form and content, right? It's about policies and policy offerings that speak to the challenges of people's lives. It's also the form in which those alternatives and those policies are propagated. And it's not just to say, oh, yes, use social media, put out TikTok videos and so on. Of course, that is important. Using non-traditional forms of social media. It's no longer just about putting up party posters on lampposts and handing out pamphlets and kind of hoping for the best, right? It's using non-traditional forms of media and so on. But it's about the content and the form, and really, as I say, trying to capture people's imagination, looking at demographics, looking at young people, not just having politicians who are all really old and maybe not engaging with changes in people's economic problems and social values and so on. And probably this also goes to kind of the internal democracy of parties and having offerings that can appeal to people across the board. I think this maybe connects, and maybe it will be my last comment on this with your question around who should we work with and so on. And I understood that to mean not just as academics, but kind of progressive forces. In many countries, what I'm referring broadly to progressive forces have often been quite fragmented and have a tendency of kind of dividing on points that might seem important but in the bigger picture might not necessarily be worth fragmenting about. And sometimes conservative forces do better of kind of working together and sort of putting, maybe it's because they're more authoritarian, but putting sort of points of difference, overcoming those. So as progressive forces, it's really important to build those kind of alliances between the youth and student movements, feminist organizations, environmental organizations, trade unions, political parties, social movements around housing, and so on. Not to agree on every point, right? But to say, yes, there are some common denominators that we can agree on and work together and build those kind of progressive fronts or popular forms of political alliances and so on. I think, yeah, I'm talking very much from a global South perspective. I know that it might not resonate so much in a European context, but I think some of it might still carry forward in terms of not being fragmented on points of difference that might not be most fundamental in the bigger picture of where society is.
Well, thank you very much. Karsten, would you like to say 2 words about the academia? And then I'd like to ask Laszlo to kind of final comment.
I might open another discussion here, but I do have the view that universities in this struggle should not enter the field of active, policy and making or politics. This is what I think illiberals try. I mean, this is what Orban tried, all of a sudden depicting us as a political actor. This is what Trump tries with Harvard and so on. Universities need to defend the procedure of academic work, not the content. So we must defend the freedom, the academic freedom, that we can do research on whatever we think is worth doing, and whatever is the outcome is the result of an either good or bad academic work. This is, I think, the best and the most effective contribution universities can do to open societies, to liberal societies, liberal democracy.
Thank you very much. Laszlo, I'd like to ask you to say a couple of final words, listening to this rich discussion.
Thank you, Albert. I take that not as any kind of conclusion, because I was free riding an exciting discussion with a very interesting contribution. When Pedro mentioned the 20th century politics of Bolsonaro, it immediately brought me back the book of Alfred Stepan on military in politics that was written about the Brazilian army and the military. And of course, as everyone knows, Alfred Stepan was the founding rector of the Central European University, and he was one of the initiators of the long tradition of CEU of furthering East-South, North-South dialogue as a very fruitful thing. And that was, to me, again, a fantastic example of the use, of the joy of this type of dialogue with you. From Fiona, we learned the mixture of how the mixture of shallow democracy and exclusionary economic policies might be a disaster. Pedro's interesting ideas about the capacity of democracy to create transformative alliances. That's a terribly important thing, because there are no other regimes that can do that. And that gives hope. And it was very important that Karsten mentioned the idea of this, I think it was Merkel who talked about, not long ago, about market-conform democracies, which reminds us that unmaking or making shallow democracies was man-made. It didn't happen. It was not any kind of weakness of democracy, but there were decades of making democracies shallower. Hollowing the democracy was made in the last 15 or 20 years. But then what gives hopes is that democracy has the capacity to create or provide room for transformative alliances. So with this, I would like to end with these positive notes, and thank you so much for this exciting discussion.
Okay, so it was really nice to have all of you. Thank you very much for celebrating with us 5 years of the CEU Democracy Institute. Pedro Almovedé, Fiona Tregena, and Karsten Schneider, and in my name of my wonderful colleagues Ece Özbey and Robert Nemeth, thank you very much, and thank you for all the listeners. We hope you enjoy this pop-up discussion on the enormous complexity and challenges, and hopefully intellectual joy of revigorating and redesigning democracy for the future. So thank you very much.